For nearly 15 years, from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s, it was my father's special calling to help the poor in West Virginia. And although he was a Presbyterian minister and not a Catholic priest, he took what amounted to a vow of poverty in order to do that job, offering to work at the poverty level so that his ministry could be more incarnational. My mother's calling was different. As a self-appointed evangelical missionary, she was determined to share the good news about Jesus with as many people as she could while we were there in West Virginia. But as a mother, she was determined that her boys would love the Lord, study hard, and stay away from junk food. As a result of my father's poverty and my mother's convictions, my brothers and I didn't have much ice cream or candy when we were growing up. And we certainly didn't have soft drinks, except on the one vacation we took each year, whether we had money or not. My father would gas up the family station wagon, we would all pile inside, and then he would drive as far as he could go before we had to stop for gas. My mother would be sitting in the front passenger seat all that time, often spreading commodity peanut butter on thick slabs of homemade whole wheat bread, making sandwiches and handing them over the back seat just as fast as she could go. We sat back there eating those sandwiches, reading books, counting cows, singing 100 bottles of beer on the wall, and looking forward to that first gas stop. Because when it came, finally, my father would do something he didn't do at any other time of the year. He would pull up to the pump, get out of the car, and then, while my mother was looking the other way, dig down deep into his pocket to find a quarter for each of us. We would tiptoe across the hot pavement in bare feet and come to a stop in front of the soft drink vending machine. Do you remember those machines? In those days, they had a long, narrow glass door on the right-hand side through which you could see the bottle caps of the different beverages. You would put your quarter into the slot, open up that door like a refrigerator door, grab one of those ice-cold bottles of soda by its neck, and then give it a good hard yank. And if everything worked as it was supposed to, the machine would release the bottle and it would come out with a loud, satisfying chunk, chunk. There was an opener built right into the machine so that you could pop the top off that bottle and watch the vapor from the carbonation rise up inside the neck. It would waft down over the sides, and you would take your first sip, which was so cold, so delicious, so satisfying, especially after waiting a year, that I can hardly describe it. For me, there was that burst of flavor, the sweetness on my tongue, the tickle of those bubbles in my nose. I could have made a commercial. My favorite in those days was orange soda. I liked the reliable flavors of a knee-high orange, the slightly sweeter taste of a Fanta, or the strong, tingling surge of an orange crush. Not that I was a connoisseur. When you taste only one bottle a year, it's hard to develop the discriminating palate necessary for such a thing. Still, I like to think that I knew my orange soda. I savored every sip. And when I daydreamed in school, I sometimes daydreamed of having a house with a kitchen sink that had 3 knobs. One for hot water, one for cold, and one for orange soda. Can you imagine? Putting your glass under there, turning that knob, and watching it fill up with ice-cold Fanta or knee-high or orange crush. I could imagine, and I did quite often. And for me, it wasn't just the idea of having orange soda whenever I wanted. It was the idea of having lots of orange soda, buckets of it, bathtubs full. With so much scarcity in my life, I dreamed of abundance. Which is why this story about Jesus turning water into wine has always been one of my favorites. For most of my childhood, I wished that someone would come along who could work just that sort of miracle. Jesus was at a wedding, John says. in the little town of Cana in Galilee, which was probably just as small and poor as some of those towns I lived in when I was a boy. And because I went to some weddings then, I can almost picture a wedding there. Bride and groom standing outside a yellow and white trailer on a rainy day, her trying hard not to get mud on her white shoes while she lifts up the hem of her dress and he holds the umbrella for both of them, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, and a crooked grin on his face as he pretends to hike her dress up just a little higher. They've just come from the reception, which was held at the firehouse because they don't allow drinking in the fellowship hall at the Baptist church. The boys down there just backed the fire truck out into the yard, swept the concrete floor, set up some folding chairs, and brought in a case of Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine because you don't get married every day. But then Jesus showed up with a bunch of those disciples he always ran with, and before you know it, the wine was gone. Everybody started giving his mother dirty looks, and that's when she came looking for Jesus. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. "In private?" "What is it?" he asked. "They've run out of wine," she said. "That's not really our problem, is it?" he said. "Well," she replied, "it could be. They might not have run out of wine if you hadn't brought all your wine-bibbing buddies with you. Here," she said to some of the firemen, "do whatever he tells you." And suddenly there they were, standing around Jesus looking at him like they were expecting some kind of miracle or something. For a full minute, he didn't say anything. Like he told his mother, his hour had not yet come. But at last he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Is there any water on the fire truck?" "Oh yeah," they answered, it's full of water." "Well, drag a hose in here," he said, "and fill up that tub over there." It was one of those big galvanized metal wash tubs hanging on the wall. They used to fill it with ice and put those little bottles of Coca-Cola in it for their annual barbecue fundraiser. But for Jesus' sake, they took it down, dragged the fire hose in, opened the valve just a notch, and watched in amazement as dark red wine flowed out of the nozzle and into the tub. If they had been connoisseurs, they might have known that it was a nice Chateau Lafite from a good vintage year. They didn't. But the Methodist minister who performed the ceremony, a kind of snobby social activist type from Ohio, took one sip and said, "Oh my, that's good wine." And that's when everyone there looked down at that wash tub full of wine, and then down at the hose still lying on the ground, and then followed it with their eyes out the door to that truck, that big tanker truck full of water, and realized with a kind of a pleasurable tingle that this was going to be the best wedding reception they had ever attended. And then they looked back at Jesus and felt the little hairs on the back of their neck stand up. No matter how you tell the story, it's that moment that matters. The moment of Epiphany, when the door between heaven and earth opens just a crack, and the dazzling light from the other side begins to seep in around the edges. It's the moment in the Gospels where people begin to see Jesus for who he really is. John calls this miracle in Cana a sign. And like all signs, it points to something else. You see water turned into wine, and that's something, but then you look at the one who did it, and that's something else altogether. John says that Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Did you catch that? John doesn't say that they believed in miracles. He says that they believed in Jesus. But what did they believe him to be? A miracle worker, a magician, or something more? There was an old legend in those days about the Messiah, God's anointed, who would come to his people Israel and set them free. Not everyone believed that legend, of course, and not everyone believed it the same way, but some of the rumors about this Messiah were that when he came, he would usher in a new age, and that one of the characteristics of this age would be unprecedented abundance. Listen to this passage from Isaiah 25. The Lord will destroy the shroud that is cast over all peoples. He will swallow up death forever and wipe away the tears from all faces. On this mountain he will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. Or this one, from Jeremiah 31, they shall come and sing aloud on the height of Zion, and they shall be radiant over the goodness of the Lord, over the grain, the wine, and the oil, and over the young of the flock and the herd. Their life shall become like a well-watered garden, and they shall never languish again. When the Messiah comes, there's going to be plenty, the Scriptures say. The banquet table will be loaded down. The wine will flow like water. That may not mean much to the man who has everything, but to the one who has almost nothing, it would sound mighty sweet, wouldn't it? In those places where I grew up in West Virginia, and in the kind of poverty that was there, people put most of their hope in God. They knew that they had little chance of getting a good education or a high-paying job. Probably, like their fathers and grandfathers before them, they would do what they could to scratch out a living in those stingy hills. But when times got especially hard, they would pray to the only one they knew who was really on their side and who could really do something for them. And every once in a while, something would happen. Someone would show up at their door with a basket of food when they really needed it. A collection might be taken up at church for someone whose husband had been killed in the coal mines. Or something would happen that they couldn't explain by any natural means, and they would just marvel. They would catch a glimpse of God's glorious light seeping in around the edges of their dark reality. And they would believe in Him, just like those disciples saw what Jesus did in the little mountain town of Cana and believed in Him. You know, when I preached on this passage 6 years ago, a devastating earthquake had just hit Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. One journalist wrote, "I was here during the 2008 hurricanes that left thousands dead and thousands homeless, and that felt like the apocalypse. But that pales in comparison to this." But in the aftermath of that horrific tragedy, the Reverend Pat Robertson suggested that the Haitians were cursed because of a pact their ancestors made with the devil 2 centuries ago. Ever since, he said, they have been cursed by one thing after the other. Although he didn't go so far as to say that this earthquake was God's wrath poured out on the people of Haiti, what else could they infer? Robertson seems to subscribe to an Old Testament theology that makes every act an act of God. If San Francisco fell into the ocean this afternoon, he would be on television tomorrow telling us why. But even as I heard him make those outrageous statements, I prayed that the people of Haiti would not look at things the way he does. I prayed that they could understand as we do that bad things happen to good people, sometimes to the best people we know, and for no apparent reason. When Jesus' disciples asked him, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind, in John chapter 9, Jesus said, it wasn't this man or his parents. It was so the works of God can be seen. I prayed that that's what would happen in Haiti. I prayed that those people could understand that earthquakes happen not because God is angry, but because the crust of this living earth we live on shifts and moves. I prayed that they would see this earthquake for the natural disaster that it was, but see in our response to that disaster the works of God. And I think they did. as rescue workers came from this country and others, as relief flowed into the ruined city of Port-au-Prince, I think the Haitians witnessed an abundance unlike anything they had seen before, an abundance of compassion. And my prayer in those days was that they might see it as a sign, not of God's judgment, but of God's grace. I prayed that the door between heaven and earth might be opened just a crack, and that they might see light seeping in around the edges. So may it be in all those troubled places in the world these days. May God's people pour out God's compassion until it flows like wine at a wedding.